focused on cloud and co-location, data center industry trends, and dynamic market.
Good morning, good evening, everyone. It's Dan Scarborough here with Data Center Hawk. I'm very excited today. I'm with Matthew Madden, the CEO from DXN, who's an Australia's only vertically integrated data center company. Matthew, maybe you could give a bit of an intro to yourself and DXN for our audience, and then we can talk about the Australian market and what you're up to.
Yeah, sure, Dan. So DXN is, as you mentioned, the only vertically integrated data center company. What does that mean? I think that's the question we often get asked. So let's start with the beginning. So we design, build, and manufacture prefabricated modular data centers, and we do that out of our factory in Perth. And then we are also a DC operator. So we have two sides to the business: manufacturing and data center operations. So a data center operations business manages, today we have two data centers online, one in Tasmania and one in Sydney. And I know you have a particular passion about sustainability associated to data centers, and you'd be pleased to know that our data center in Tasmania uses hydro electricity. So it's 100% renewable.
Does it really? Fantastic. Let's come on to that in a minute, right? Because I've kind of split my questions into two things. Because for me, I think your company is really interesting. I've been looking at your business model, and I love the fact that you've got this modular data center business, and you're delivering modular solutions to Australian customers. And I'm assuming those same customers are also becoming customers for your centralized data centers as well.
Well, as we grow out, so we're a very new business. So essentially we are doing that. We have a data center in Sydney, right in the middle of Sydney. So Sydney Olympic Park, which, you know, with its name, hosted the 2000 Olympics. So our data center is based right there, and that is centrally located. And the theme that we have is about our data centers is, we have a tagline: making global local. So really what we're talking about is the global being the internet, and the local being the market in which we operate in. So that particular line has a flow right through our business. So if you think about this, Dan, 50% of the world's population is still not connected to the internet.
Yeah, which is bonkers, right?
And you know what we see in developed countries is that we see, you know, great broadband access, the use of the internet and how we can use it. And in fact, doing an interview with somebody in the UK, in London, and somebody in Melbourne, in Australia, and utilizing the internet to do that. So for us, it's how do we have that impact on it? Rather than just looking at it from a centralized co-location data center point, we look at it from how do we bring the internet closer to that community or that customer to make that happen. Now in Australia, there are 2.25 million people that still do not have a reliable internet. And we call that here the digital divide. And we recently rolled out a national broadband network called NBN. And NBN's mandate was to bring reliable broadband internet to the population of Australia. And then as a wholesale operator, and then the retail operators would sit over the top of that and supply services to people. Now, unfortunately, 2.25 million people still do not have reliable internet delivered to their home. And that digital divide is something that happens in our country. Now, if you imagine that in a Pacific island, for example, so our manufacturing business builds cable landing stations, as an example. So the subsea cables are really the internet. So if we think we had a bit of a laugh about this. If you think the internet lives in the clouds, well, it doesn't. It lives under the ocean. So the reality is that those subsea cables bring the internet into countries. And we take that view of being an edge operator is that we want to be part of that journey at the beginning. So recently we picked up a piece of business with Southern Cross Cable Networks. Now, Southern Cross is the largest provider of, call it internet access or data access into Australia. So in fact, they bring about 80% of the internet into the country, and we're helping them grow their network in the Pacific. So recently we deployed in a COVID ravaged world, we deployed a cable landing station into Fiji for them.
Fantastic.
Recently.
So let's just so let's come back to this in a minute, because I've kind of I like the cable landing station, and I think the world is becoming a lot more about digital infrastructure as opposed to just data centers, right?
Correct.
And there has to be an interrelation between the grid and the network and the data center where the data resides. But let's just, for our audience, I think, because we got people listening to this from all over the world, right?
Sure.
And lots of them are interested in two different sides. But if we look particularly about the co-location market in Australia, as a relatively new entrant into the market, can you just give them maybe a bit of insight into the colo market in Australia and what that looks like?
Yeah, so the colo market in Australia really operates into two, I would say two quite distinct markets. You have the hyperscale market, which is your wholesale market, which your listeners and readers would be well used to. And then you have the traditional co-location market, which, you're seeing what we would call, hybrid IT. So they would have some on-premise in a data center, co-located, and some interconnection with the cloud operators to provide that full service to their customers. So co-location really is a market in Australia that has, during COVID has not been an active market. It's been an okay market.
So
hyperscale operators and growth in hyperscale has been a massive growth in Australia. And
that's what I was going to say. I mean, so have you seen a lot of demand from the international kind of cloud providers?
Yeah, well, when COVID sort of really hit in March last year, a lot of capacity that had been built in Australia for the hyperscale operators was soaked up. So existing relationships, existing capacity, they needed to get more capacity into their either their Teams platforms or their Zoom platforms or whatever was driving that capacity growth, and that saw a huge uptake for the likes of NextDC, AirTrunk, and Equinix.
Right. Okay. And was that from US cloud providers and Chinese cloud providers? So both of them, or
predominantly US cloud providers, predominantly
right.
US.
And do you see much demand coming from the Chinese guys into Australia, or?
Yeah, look, we're hoping that some sensibility does start to creep into the market. There has been with the Five Eyes sort of relationships that have existed between governments, and if you talk the Five Eyes, you're talking Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the United States, and the United Kingdom. Those governments sort of have a view on the influence of China in regions, and Australia sort of gets caught right in the mix of that. Australia and New Zealand gets caught right in the mix of that. So we have seen a sort of a step back by the Chinese operators, particularly in Australia. But, I'm hoping some sensibility does start to play through and we can work through those solutions and we can start to see, a leveler playing field of cloud operators.
And so in terms of the soaking up demand and, available capacity, what would you say? Is there a lot of capacity in Sydney and for people from a colo hyperscale perspective, or is there not a great deal of availability at the moment?
So colo, I think that there is some capacity there still, definitely. I think there's more capacity coming online. So Australia is putting, certainly Sydney, which I would say is the dominant market for Australia for cloud, then followed by Melbourne. You're seeing a lot of capacity coming online, a lot.
And what's the sort of the pricing of land, power, and how much does that vary across Australia? I mean, the prices that people are paying for land in places like London and Frankfurt are like 7 million an acre. It's ridiculous pricing. Is it equivalent pricing?
It's no different in Sydney, no different at all. So Sydney is, as a real estate market, is ridiculous. it is right up the top in terms of those prices. So it wouldn't be too dissimilar. So what we're seeing is a lot of the cloud operators are pushing further west in Sydney. So Sydney's quite an expansive city. If you've not been here before, it's quite a big spread. So you could be it goes from the base of the Blue Mountains all the way down to the ocean, effectively. So that's the spread from the west, and then north it goes up to basically Gosford, and then in the south it goes down to Wollongong. So if you sort of drew a compass there, you from the CBD, you're sort of drawing almost a 70 kilometre to 80 kilometre ring around the city.
So it's a big space, a big space. Yeah, it's a big space. And then in terms of, Australia versus kind of the wider Asia Pacific and Australasia market, what sort of comments have you got on Australia versus other markets from a colo size perspective?
Yeah, so it's right up there. I think, look, it's probably on a similar size to Singapore, the Singapore market. It's starting to get to that sort of length. And what's creating that growth is more subsea cables that are coming in to the country as well. So the more capacity you have from a cable perspective, the more you're going to see it grow. We're also seeing, some movement towards Singapore and Sydney as different havens, as the influence of China into Hong Kong and those sorts of markets, which we talked about a little bit earlier. And I'm not wanting to drag politics into it, but we have seen some movements into Singapore and into Sydney as a direct result of Hong Kong not being as desirable a place to put data centers.
Politics always gets involved, unfortunately, doesn't it? So back to you guys. I'm assuming at the minute you're pretty focused on Australia as a business.
Well, it's interesting you say that. We have a strong focus in and around Australia. So I would say we focus into the Pacific Islands and also into Southeast Asia, not Singapore, although we do have customers in Singapore where we supply services to, but predominantly we have a focus in and around that Asia Pacific area. Yes.
So in terms of your strategy as a business, looking at kind of your design and your data center design, it looks like you're very focused on the modular data center and a separate module for each customer, right? So from what I could see from the videos that I looked at, you're basically putting the containers into the building and giving access to particular customers. Is that?
Yeah, that's one approach. Look, the interesting thing in the Australian marketplace is the tyranny of distance. So distance drives a whole bunch of things, and latency is an aspect that gets driven in this country as well. So the further you are away from Sydney, the greater the latency drag that you have on your applications. So from a B2B perspective, our focus in Australia is outside of Sydney and outside of Melbourne. So we're looking at regional centres, and our first step out was into Hobart and Tasmania. So whilst it's not the same population size that a hyperscaler would be interested in, from an edge perspective and being able to provide that additional services with smaller capacity, we have that focus. So, if you like, think of us as the guys that do colo to 250 racks.
Yeah, I mean, I looked at some of the stuff that you've announced recently, and your kind of mining sector, the agri-tech sector. I saw an announcement with the Connected Farms contract, which I think you won recently, and the Newcrest Mining Streamline Connect. These are all quite exciting edge deployments, I would imagine. And again, I think it's really fascinating to see a company that's got both the central colo site and the edge business. Quite interested to work out, on the sustainability thing and on the way that you're kind of powering those edge units. How are you doing that? Is that what sort of on-site power generation are you using, or how does that work in the
No,
field?
so look, we connect generally to the grid and then have your backup power associated to that. Look, we are looking at other ways to do it, and bringing sort of gas cogeneration as an opportunity to certain sites. But I think I just wanted to just step back a little bit on the reference that you made to the mining sector and the agri-tech sector, just for a second. The reason we focused on those two sectors is because of the very nature of autonomous vehicles. So if you think about the mining sector in Australia, Australia is the largest autonomous vehicle operator in the world, and that's our mining sector. So a lot of the big trucks and big scrapers that you see in iron ore mines or coal mines or those sorts of things are remotely controlled. So we build, if you like, we build the data center or the environment for those vehicles. So if you imagine something that weighs, 50, 55 tons, 60 tons hurtling around a track, you really don't want to be too far away from it when you're controlling it remotely. So that's where we see an initial growth sector. That is an area that we're going to learn a lot from. And if you think about where Edge is really going to take it, it's really into that industrial IoT sector, and start to have those business to business engagements. And eventually, when we get to a point where your public road system is mainly driven by autonomous vehicles, DXN will be in a strong position to be able to service those markets. So that's why I wanted to draw it there. Now,
that's interesting. Is that the same for farming, is it as well? Or?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. So essentially big farming or larger farming is moving down an autonomous vehicle path simply because they cannot get the labor to the sites. And this was the issue that started with the mining sector. So if you can have a John Deere tractor, which has got a cellular receiver on it, and transceiver, remotely controlled, going around a large acreage doing either the wheat harvesting, as an example, or barley harvesting, you don't need to have a guy sitting there doing that. It can go 24/7 and get the job done. So we're going to start to see a lot of that happening around the world.
And would you say that that was kind of what percentage of the mining and the agri tech sector is doing that autonomous mining?
So the agri-tech sector is certainly just starting on that journey, but your large mine operators in Australia today, certainly in the open cut market, where they're digging out raw materials, I would say, if you looked at BHP or Rio Tinto or Fortescue Metals, a lot of their mine sites are tagged autonomous. So that can be the trains coming in to pick up and take away the iron ore, as an example, or the scrapers digging it out, or the trucks taking it to the trains or from the mine site. So you've got a huge market there.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to on another time maybe go into more detail about that. And if you've got any video footage or any other content about some of your deployment, I think that'd be really interesting.
Sure,
I'm going to jump now, because one of the areas that I'm very focused on is the kind of this transition towards sustainable digital infrastructure, the energy transition, as you like. And data center operators in Europe announced last week a pledge to make data centers climate neutral by 2050. I'm wondering, I want to find out about your hydro data center in a second, but can you see the same happening in Australia? Do you see that same thing happening, or?
Yeah, well, if you talk about carbon neutral data center footprint, right, it really starts with the construction of the data center. So if you build a building, you are having a massive impact on the carbon on that market. So building the data center is also an aspect associated to becoming carbon neutral. DXN does that in a factory. So we do all of the work inside a factory and then ship it to site. So there's two things that happen when we do that. The first thing that happens is that we have a lower impact on carbon emissions by doing that in a central location. The second part is that we ship it to site, we reduce the time on site for the build, again, reducing a carbon footprint. So if you think about a containerized solution or a modular solution that we do, we have an impact at the start. And I think a lot of that gets lost when it goes into operations. So if you think of the number of data centers that are being built in bricks and mortar solutions, and not using modular construction techniques as an example.
Oh, no, I hear you. I hear what you're saying. I mean, scope 3 emissions are massive, right? And are not taken into consideration at all. So you mentioned a hydro powered data center. Is that hydro power, i.e. you're near a hydro power plant, or how's that?
So it's a hydro power plant. So Tasmania is one of those rare parts of Australia that actually has a full hydro power solution. Most of the power plants in Australia are coal driven.
Yeah, I've seen that.
So, you know, we are on a long journey to get us off that hook. So, you know, your impact of solar, your impact of wind, your impact of hydro is hard because Australia is a pretty dry continent. So there's the snowy hydro, which is in the snowy mountains. In Europe, you would probably call our Alps a hill, but in Australia we call it a mountain. And we have water that comes there that's generated into both New South Wales and Victoria, so power, but not enough. Certainly not enough to be powering the data center footprints that are growing here, and especially in Sydney. In Tasmania, because of its size and because it has a Franklin River in there, it has a lot of power that's driven, well, almost 90% of its power is driven by hydro.
Yeah, I'm surprised that when I looked at it, I was surprised that there wasn't more solar there, because you've got a lot of sun, right? You've got a ton of sun. But
it's a double-edged sword, Dan. So you've got to think that the mining sector in Australia has a very powerful voice.
Yeah.
It kind of goes against what they want, especially with coal.
Yeah, no, I get that. So are you seeing any demand from the customers from like a circularity perspective? Do you see anything on the IT hardware now I'm talking about? So are you seeing anything along those lines, or not as of yet?
Not as yet, but as an example, we're working on an opportunity at the moment to design for a customer an immersed, liquid immersed CPUs. So building a data center that effectively, if you think about a container, they want to be able to get 2.2 megawatts into a container.
Interesting.
One container.
Yeah. No,
and these are the cryptocurrency miners. So I think because of their huge power demand and really close cost management associated to power, and the fact that they want lots of power, and the fact that they also want it as a tier 0 data center. So effectively no backup or recovery. So if it loses power, it loses power.
Where is that based? Where is that going to be deployed? Is that in Tasmania? Is it? Or?
Well, Tasmania is one area that we're looking at for them, but they're also looking, you know, basically from Sydney down, you know, Victoria, Sydney, you know, locations where land is cheap, they can get good power or good proximity to power, but more importantly, one of the things about a data center is that, you know, if you think about this, and you know lots about data centers, effectively we put an oven inside a fridge.
Yeah.
That's what we're doing. So we're keeping an oven cool.
Yeah, I get you.
If you think about how these guys are sort of architecting it, is that they're bringing that CPU into a water immersed environment to keep it cool, so they can get more power in. So,
is the power rate really, the cost of power cheap over there then? Because
In Australia, no, the cost of power is expensive.
So what sort of cost per kilowatt hour are you at in?
I'll have to come back to you on that.
The only reason I ask is that a lot of the crypto deployments that I've seen are mainly in the cheaper power locations like Norway and Sweden, where you're getting like sub 5 cents a kilowatt hour, 5 euro cents a kilowatt hour. That seems to be one of the key drivers for that. But I'm assuming that they're more Australian crypto businesses that you're working with, are they? Yeah. Matthew, it's been very, very interesting to speak with you. And yeah, I'm excited about your business and what you're doing. And I'd love to stay in touch and revisit it with you in, next year or even earlier, just to see how things are going.
Okay, sounds good, Dan.
Great. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.